my history with the school here goes way, way, way back. So first of all, I want to say, so I've been working on bringing together the sectors now, as I spent 35 years, written 3 books on this topic, and working for many years trying to get a lot of this public policy schools of public management closer with both the business and philanthropy. And I will say that USC probably does this better than any other school in the country, thanks to Jim's work and the Bedrosians and others. What you've done here is what schools need to do, I think, all over the country. So you've provided an incredible model for bringing these together. So it's so great. This is, I think, my 4th or 5th time speaking here over the years. And the other thing is, years ago, probably 27 years ago or so, I was a commissioner for the city of LA when Robin was doing a lot of work with Mayor Reardon as his lead advisor. And Mike Keeley, who was the deputy mayor there and a good friend of Robin's, asked me to lead a research project with the school here, analyzing the budget and where they could find cost savings opportunities, efficiency opportunities. They didn't have a lot of necessarily staff to do a lot of that. And it was a really incredible project, and Robin tells me that it had some good shelf life over there. So a long history here, and so it's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to run through some of these ideas from the new book I've done with Don Kettl, and then we'll have a great panel discussion. So I wanted to start off by taking you back to the mid-1800s to the UK, to the introduction of the automobile, which was called the locomotive at the time. And they went, the maximum speed was 5 miles per hour. Most of them went between 3 and 5 miles per hour, but because these were so new, these new contraptions, what do we do with the UK Parliament passed a series of red flag acts. And in the acts, one of the preconditions of it was essentially for each of the automobiles, they had to have a crew of 3 at least manning it, and they had to have an individual walking 60 paces in front of the automobile with a big red flag, just to warn pedestrians. Now, it sounds crazy in retrospect, but why did they do it that way? Well, it's because they had a mental model of that roads were meant for horses, and they didn't want to scare the horses through these locomotives. Now, but the reality of it was that it really delayed a lot of the introduction of road transport and automobiles for decades in the UK, because they had a kind of an old mental model of what do we do when a new technology came around. I'm going to give you a second example. So for years and years and years, baseball scouts, of course, would judge the baseball player oftentimes by how he looked or what his physical, was he big and powerful? Did he look like a baseball player and things like that? And what happened was a lot of really good players were ignored because they didn't have that right look. And then Billy Beane, of course, came along with the Oakland A's with a data-driven approach, which was immortalized in Moneyball by Michael Lewis and then the movie. And baseball and all sports have never been the same since. Third example, how old do you think the average college student is in America? Anyone want to guess? What would you guess? Most people guess 20 years old. So New America, a think tank I'm affiliated with, they've done a survey, and most people say 20 because they think the average college student is 18 to 22. Well, in fact, the majority of college students are over 25 years old because there's mid-career, there's grad students, and so on. But we have a mental model of college students a certain way. So why am I bringing all this up? I bring it up to you because if your mental model is flawed, what it does is it obscures the ability to really see a lot of the possibilities. And when we think about government, the mental model that we see portrayed in the media oftentimes and by politicians is this government is kind of a vending machine. You have a big problem, you pass a law to deal with it, you create an organization, you put money in the slot, and out is supposed to pop these results. Now, that's not how government actually works today at all. It works through these complex networks. But that mental model has oftentimes prevented us from really seeing effective solutions to problems. Now, Don and I, between us, we've got 75 years working on public management, especially implementation. We've written about 35 books between us. And we wrote this book because we really wanted to provide a new vision of governance in the 21st century that reflected how government actually operates today, as opposed to what we might read about oftentimes in the media or even different textbooks. And at the core of our proposition is this, that no single problem that matters anymore can be solved by a single organization. Now, can you think of any major problem or even any real service today that's just delivered by one, say, government department? Can anyone think of anything? Most people don't really have a good answer to that. And, even firefighting, some people often say, well, what about firefighting? Well, if you actually think about what fire departments do, 95% of the calls now are emergency response. And we were talking to a firefighter who had been there for years, and he was pointing up at these big, tall buildings, and he said, what's way more important was the building codes and the architects and all these people than essentially what we do for preventing fires. So this is really at the core of what we're talking about, whether it's homelessness or emergency response, refugee resettlement. All of these problems, they really blur across boundaries that legislatures have created around organizations to solve them. Now think about homelessness. Is it a housing issue? Is it a jobs issue? Is it a mental health issue? Is it a crime issue? Is it the job of local government, of state government, of the federal government, nonprofits? Does the private sector care? And the answer to all those questions is yes. But we don't have necessarily discrete departments of homelessness that will bring all of that together. So all of these problems, they've kind of lopped across these boundaries. And so we need a new approach for how to effectively address these big issues that we have. And what we need is more like a symphony approach. So think about an orchestra. You might have the world's best violinist or cellist or trombone players. But if they're not all playing from the same sheet of music, you're not going to have a very good performance. And it's really the same thing now when you look at government. So increasingly, its role is really more as an orchestra conductor. And oftentimes, government's not necessarily at the center of all of these. It might play very, very different roles. And that's what our book is all about. And at the center of this are the orchestra conductors, and we call these individuals bridge builders. Bridge builders are really the glue that holds these together, and they work across boundaries. They are able to break down silos. They're able to create mutual advantage between the different sectors, aligning incentives, forging unity from diversity, and really, really good at moving across these boundaries. So, and when you think about different mayors, this was something that then Mayor Reardon was really good at because of his long history in philanthropy and in business. And in New York City, Mike Bloomberg did this at scale in a way that we have seen few mayors doing it. In Denver, when John Hickenlooper was mayor, he'd been a bar owner and also very involved in the community before he became mayor. So he really understood the interest of the business community then. And he was able to raise over $295 million for all of his initiatives. And they all involve bringing in the different sectors. So these are the bridge builders that we talk about. The book has 10 different chapters, and in each chapter, we lay out these sort of core strategies, principles for bridge building, and with over 100 different strategies and tips for how to do it. Now, I don't have time to go through all these today. To learn more, you're going to actually have to buy the book, and it's on sale right now on Amazon as part of, I guess they've got some Prime Week or something coming up. So, but I'm going to go through a few of them today. The first one I want to go through is the chapter 1, which is looking at knocking down barriers. Now, this was the anniversary of 9/11 earlier this month. And on that day, Michael Day, who was in charge of the Coast Guard in New York City, in that area, he came out and it was just going to be a regular day for him, and he looked and he saw the towers, and he originally thought it was a helicopter or something. He didn't think the Coast Guard was going to have necessarily any big role to play. And then it soon became apparent that that was not the case at all. And Day said, we're going to have to do something to get people off of Manhattan. So what he did was and they didn't have a lot of communication, so he had to kind of get on a call, and he said to all available boats, anyone wanting to help with evacuation of Lower Manhattan, come to Governor's Island. And they end up having tugboats and cruise ships and all sorts of any kind of boats available come there to help to evacuate individuals from Manhattan. And he had to do this, and then when he was directing the boats, he actually had to use hand signals because they didn't have any ability. All the mobile communications were down at the time. So this is a little bit how that flotilla looked on that day. And what was remarkable about it was they evacuated 500,000 people from Manhattan in a day. And this was a Coast Guard just taking it upon himself to do this. And this was a bigger boat lift evacuation than we've seen any time since Dunkirk. And in fact, it was even larger than Dunkirk. And Dunkirk was 10 days during World War II. This was one day. And what Michael Day said, and we found this when we interviewed a lot of them, which is I broke my more rules that day than I enforced my entire Coast Guard career. We have a new podcast called Government's Future Frontiers, which just launched last week. And we interview Michael Day about this, and I highly recommend it. For him just talking about that day and his role is so important. Now, one of the reasons why they did this and was able to work so well was when the Exxon Valdez accident occurred in Alaska in the late 1890s. Coast Guard was pretty slow to respond, so they had to completely reorient all of their emergency response around response and thinking about it much more in this sort of a network model. So what are some of the lessons? You want to break down barriers, create a network focused on the mission, and really the really important one is a focus on outcomes, not process. And this came up time and time again on the Bridgebuilders. They were able to have a lot of success, was a laser focus on what are the results we need. And oftentimes they did have to break some rules. We saw that with Thad Allen, who was also with the Coast Guard in the Hurricane Katrina cleanup. The next one I want to talk about is building trustworthy networks. It's no big secret to any of you, but we have a real trust crisis in government all over the world today, but not only in government, in institutions in general, whether it's media, journalism, we've got a real bad trust crisis, and we were at really some of the lowest levels we've seen. And I'm going to tell you a story about some ways to restore some trust, but I want to go back to census. So the annual census day, when we do the census, is April 1st. So I want to take you back to 2020, April 1st, when census was supposed to launch, the 2020 census. So what was going on during that time? You had COVID, right? So think about this, that they're launching the census. No one can go door to door. And so everything they've been planning for a decade has all been disrupted. And in 220 plus years, there's never been a significant delay in the census despite Civil War, 2 world wars, depression, and so on. It's incredibly important, of course, for congressional apportionment and for funding and so on. So they had to figure out a way of getting this done. So they had to delay the door-to-door counts, but this wasn't the only big problem that they had, because there was also a big problem of trust happening with the census at the time. And why was that? Well, if you recall, the Trump administration wanted to put a citizenship question on this. And so within a lot of communities, here in Los Angeles and elsewhere, there's massive distrust of the census, and also a lot of disinformation, misinformation about it swirling around. So they had these monumental twin challenges that they had to deal with. Lack of trust, and they couldn't go door to door for a while. So what did they do? Well, they got to work to try to figure this out. They formed a team called the Trust and Safety Team. And what they were going to do is they figured they had to tap into this large ecosystem of different diverse players: civil society organizations, consumer advocates, technology partners, fact-check organizations. And they ended up having over 400,000 partners in getting the census done. And what they did was they said, we're going to need to reach out to a lot of those organizations that are trusted within the local communities, because they're going to have a higher trust. So we're going to create a trusted partner network. And they also work with technology, all the major social media companies, looking at the disinformation, misinformation, and seeing what they could do to rebut a lot of it. There's a young guy who led this. His name was Zach Schwartz, and he talked about even the local barbershop where he lived, and the beauty salon, and so on. They had census signs up as part of those massive amounts of partners they had, and they also hired dozens of partnership specialists on a temporary basis just to work those sort of relationships. One of the big challenges was reaching a very hard to count population due to mistrust. And so they had to work with a lot of different churches and different communities. And within the Black churches, they put up a website, a whole website around why it's important to fill out the census. And they would have block parties with DJs and all sorts of activities, working with the National African American Clergy Network to address this sort of issue. And the undercounting, we're still actually reading about it now. So this massive, massive problem. And what did they end up with through this? 99.98% of all housing units and addresses nationwide were accounted for during the census. Now, that's pretty remarkable when you think about those challenges that they had. And how did they do it? They did it through bridge building. So there's a lot of key takeaways here. Leading with trust, they identified all the different pain points, all the blockages. They built bridges with very diverse groups. They were very human and sincere in their communications. And I think that sort of model, when you think about a lot of the big pieces of legislation and other things, this is a really important model for a lot of things, whether it's around digital government and digital inclusion and other areas, is finding those organizations who are trusting the communities and then partnering with them. So the last one I'm going to talk about is data. And data is the new language. Data is really the glue that holds a lot of these organizations together right now. And the data sharing piece is absolutely critical when you have large groups of different partners who are trying to accomplish the same mission. So I'm going to look at an issue very important here in Los Angeles and where I was yesterday in San Francisco, which is homelessness. So if you look at the homelessness issue, we haven't had a lot of success making a big dent out of it, despite billions of dollars spent over the last decade or so. Now, that's not the case in all cities. While this was happening, and you're having all the problems you've had in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Santa Barbara, San Diego, and throughout the West Coast, one city had different results, and that's Houston. Houston has reduced their homeless population by 63% in the last decade or so. 25,000 people are in permanent housing now who previously were unhoused. It's pretty remarkable. If you actually look, if we've been able to reach this nationwide, those kind of results, we have a couple 100,000 less individuals in America who are unhoused right now. And if you added up the homeless population in the top 10 cities, it would actually eliminate that in the top 10 cities in the country. Now, Houston didn't start off from a really rosy position. They actually, when they started off, that was the 4th largest city in America, and they had one of the largest homeless populations. Not only that, but the system was very disjointed, duplicative services. None of these organizations who were providing services could communicate with each other. So you could be getting services in one organization, and across the street, you might have been there the day before, and none of the providers would actually have any idea what was going on. So, and this problem of duplicative services and no one sort of talking to each other in that way has been a problem all over the country. It's a very, very complex sort of set of services that need to be provided and so on. So what did they do? And the other issue with Houston was like LA, it had a geography issue. The greater Houston area is bigger than the entire state of New Jersey. And it also has one of the most diverse immigrant populations in the country, along with here, with over 200 different languages being spoken. So what did they do? The key to Houston's success was two major things that they did. The first one was they created the Houston Coalition for the Homeless, and that involved over 100 different provider organizations all coming together around this mission, and a big focus on the housing piece and permanent housing. But if I going back to my symphony example, that's more organizations than you would have individuals in an average orchestra or symphony. And so they became a bit of the orchestra conductor here, working with the mayor's office. But the other key thing was the data piece. So I told you previously, none of these organizations could communicate. So they created a data system called Search. And what it did was it let all the different providers in real time have complete visibility into all the services that individual was getting, and to know what was working, what wasn't working. They were measuring outcomes. And so for each of the individuals who are homeless, they actually went from being kind of a number in a system to having a full view of their life and what sort of services they needed, where they were on their journey. And the result was a pretty miraculous 63% reduction in homelessness. And I will also say, just as a side note, they actually had a whole play, an opera on homelessness in Houston called Another City, which I thought was interesting given the orchestra metaphor product house. One of the individuals who received services was Terry Harris. She'd come upon hard times. She was in a homeless encampment. Social workers came up to her and said, "Would you like to participate in this program?" She said, "She absolutely." She had to leave her daughter with her sister. And so this gave her an opportunity to have a leg up. She got a year of permanent housing, along with a set of different services. And after that, she would be on her own, but it really gave her a chance. And 3/4 of all the individuals who were put into permanent housing were still in there several years later in Houston. So this has been a pretty remarkable success story that cities all over the country are looking at. So when you think about the homelessness issue and what Houston did, it really hits on so many of the different strategies we've talked about in the book. Nurturing private partners, finding mutual advantage, getting the business community deeply involved. We have another chapter on growing catalytic government, and that's where California comes in. With the state, obviously, has had a big focus on alternative dwelling units. And by the way, a lot of that started here in Los Angeles. Amanda Daflos, who is with the city, a former colleague of mine, she ran a program which was really to try to really increase what were kind of sometimes called granny flats, and now gone from 5,000 to 22,000 through changing policy and creating the right incentives, and then the data piece. So you can see how a lot of these principles, you pull them together in a way and you bring in the right partners to really try to solve these problems. Now, Don and I are not, we know that there's a lot of barriers to this. We're not Pollyannish about it. There's challenges of siloed funding and statutes, which is a really big barrier. There's political support. How do you get accountability in a system that's built for vertical accountability when you've got over 100 different providers as part of your network? And then bridge builder burnout. These are really, really hard things to do. How do we prevent people from getting burned out over time? So lastly, we profiled dozens of bridge builders in this book, and just amazing individuals who are going across the sectors to make a big impact. But what we need is not dozens or hundreds or even thousands. We need millions of more bridge builders in this country to address our problems and start to have much more effective government working across the sectors. And I really hope all of you will be bridge builders too. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for what was both informative and inspiring. And I really appreciate your writing the book at this time. So my name is Mark Baldassare. Thank you all for joining us today. And we're going to make sure, because Jim's going to help me with this, that there's time for questions at the end. So write down your questions and be ready to speak. I'm so delighted to be here with Bill and my colleague, Robin Kramer, who I've known for several years. I met in the mayor's office, and Robin and I have had a number of times when I've called upon her to be a co-facilitator of the Statewide Leadership Council, which I formed when I became president of a group of leaders around the state, 40 of them, and Robin was just a fabulous co-facilitator. And so here today, and I want to make sure that Robin gets to ask her most pointed questions. So I'm going to start with Robin, and then I have some things I want to, comments and questions as well. Robin.
We're going to comment less and ask more, okay? So you ready?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
I want to, but
Okay.
I want to hear from both of you.
Okay.
I'm sure everyone else does too.
So I would just say I've read the book, and overall, here's my comment on it. Not by me, but it comes from another author, inventor, American, Benjamin Franklin, who wrote in Poor Richard's Almanac, "If you would not be forgotten, as soon as you are dead and rotten, either write things worth reading or do things worth the writing," which is, I think, very much what this beautiful tome is about. So, Bill, you've been in this make governance work for 3+ decades. And I'd like to ask you, in all of the research and the beautiful PowerPoints you did and all of it, is there anything that really surprised you at all? In a positive way or an uh-oh way?
I'm actually going to answer that in terms of we're doing a new piece of, because being around this for so many years, you're less and less surprised by things. But we're doing a piece of work right now looking at 10x government, which is 10x improvements in speed or efficiency or cost savings or productivity. And when I talk to people about that, they look at me and they say, well, I don't think you're going to find many examples of that. There's a lot of skepticism. And we've now identified over 250 cases around the world of this sort of really not incremental, but transformational sort of improvements and changes. And I'm pretty optimistic, positive person, and I wouldn't have guessed that we would have found that many. So I think the big thing is that we are seeing a lot of innovation, especially in the digital area and technology now. I think the biggest issue, Robin, right now is that a lot of what's happening is happening outside of the big traditional systems of government, outside of the procurement systems, the personnel systems. So the Bridgebuilders, or a lot of the people in the digital area, what they're having to do is get exceptions and carve-outs and maybe not get noticed. And they're creating a lot of innovation outside of these systems and innovation units. And I think what we need is more politicians, more senior people willing to reform those big systems, because I think otherwise you end up with these sort of two-tiered systems where if you don't have the power, you don't have the political capital and so on to get all the carve-outs, then you're dealing with legacy systems which are decades and decades old, which don't work in the 21st century.
And is there one example you can think of that is different of the accelerator version to share? An example.
Yeah, I think one of the areas so I've written a couple books on digital government, and the complaint people always have is, why do I always have to give all my information to government so many different times? Why can't it operate more like Amazon? This is ridiculous, and so on. Well, there's a big movement in Europe, it's called Once Only, where you only have to give your information to government at any level once, and then everything else is done behind the scenes, and it's combined with something called life events model, where government starts to look at what are the big life events you have, birth or death or unemployment, or you graduating from school, and how can we create a whole basket of services around that life event. And we now have 12 of those happening at the federal level, a number in Singapore. They've organized 70, 80 services around that. So we're finally starting to see these sort of things where I wrote Government 2.0 20 years ago. I thought that was all going to happen a lot sooner. But we're really starting to see that focus around the customer experience and around the individuals. What do people really want? And that makes a big difference. In the UK, you used to have to notify 50 different agencies when you had the death of a loved one. And it's a really hard time, of course, and now you just have to do it once. And think about what a difference that makes when you're in that sort of thing. So we're starting to see some of those really interesting things happening right now in that space, especially from the customer experience and digital space in government today. And the LA City has an app, which is that Ted Lieu, who I did a presentation with yesterday, the CIO, which has done some really, really good things. And it's won a bunch of he was in Korea because they just won a big Smart City Award for the app. So some really good things happening in the digital space, but we need to see a lot more, I think, outside of that. And I think this is the answer.
Thank you. So Bill, one of the things that I noticed in your presentation and definitely in your book is that you kind of led with trust, and where the public is today with trust. And obviously, if we have better outcomes, hopefully people will have more trust in government. I'm wondering what insights you might have for our leaders about how we can inform and engage the public in the process of bridge building in a way that along the way that they feel like they're part of the solution, and that can, as a byproduct then, be a source of greater trust. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. So we've done 20 studies on trust in government in the last few years, and we've surveyed over 15,000 Americans on the trust issue. So I could speak on this all day. So a couple quick things. The first thing is the difference between wholesale and retail trust. So at the wholesale level, which is trust in government, it's really hard to move the needle because a lot of that depends on if your party's in power or not. You're going to have greater and more in the polarization. But at the retail level, which is at the individual agency level, or could be at a city level, that's where you can actually move the needle in a lot of different ways. And we've seen it happening at VA, where they've been able to get up to from where they had catastrophe a decade ago, where literally veterans were dying because of waiting times, to now 90% trust ratings by just focusing on the customer experience and trust in a deep way, and the co-creation where they do all sorts of surveys and polling and co-creation with the veterans. And so I think really looking at that at the retail level, and you know what we found when we said at the state and local level, the biggest correlation we found between any factors and trust was your experience dealing with government digitally. So we found that people had much higher levels of trust at the state and local level if they had good digital experiences. Well, governments can fix that, and you provide these things through life events, you can start to really move the needle on trust. Mark, I think the co-creation part is the key thing there, and that's where you're really working with the community, you're doing inclusive engagement, you're doing the communications. We're seeing a lot of interesting things overseas in that area, especially working with Indigenous communities in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, where they're really focusing on what sort of services do you actually need and listening more and co-creating during journey mapping and so on. And that can really help to build trust. The last thing I'll say on that was law enforcement, obviously a very big issue. One of the cases we had in the story was about a police chief from Edmonton, Dale McPhee, who focused really on trust before George Floyd incident. So he was able to bring the communities along as he went and listened, and he apologized, for instance, to the gay community where the law enforcement had a bad relationship for decades. And they said that was the first time anyone's ever listened to us and apologized for it. And so he was able to build trust during the good times. And then when they had a crisis, they didn't have to try to build it then, which is really, really difficult to do. So a lot more listening and engagement.
Hugely important. Robin, you're not expecting a question from me, but I can't help but ask you, does any of this resonate with you in terms of your time when you were in the mayor's office,
Sure.
in terms of the building of trust?
Sure. I mean, of course, because if there are no relationships in the good times, when hard times, no one knows how to talk to each other, or who to reach out to, and there are in earthquake kind of situations, there are rules. There's a chain of command on who's to do what, where, when, but everything else is up for grabs. And unless there is relationships and good disagreement, and also practice and review. So you go through, if you're in a relationship with a bunch of different kinds of people in different kinds of organizations and sectors, and face a trouble and have gone through it together, good, bad, and ugly, another key thing and a good way to build trust, though it takes time, is to, we all like to rip off good ideas from wherever, is to do an after action, is to sit down together and say, okay, where could we do better next time? And in fact, that's what happened here in LA between the police and fire departments, between mudslides and earthquakes. They practiced. And it was in part, that was the reason in those organizations that there was a better outcome than in other parts of the country where the relationships are fissured and quien es más macho and all that.
Yeah. We have a story in the book about the New York City, the police and fire departments have literally been like almost at war for decades. And we have a story about them literally all together for something and getting into a big brawl, like literally fist fights between each other. And whereas also on 9/11, when the Pentagon was hit, the person in charge then ended up being from the FBI, and they worked with the Arlington County Fire Department and others, and they'd been training together for years for something to occur. And it's probably the only time I've ever heard of this. The FBI, he turned over authority to the local fire department because they had such a relationship of trust, and that's why they were able to respond very quickly and effectively on 9/11. Because a lot of the trust piece, it's about relationships and individuals. Do you trust them? Do you trust these organizations to do the right thing?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Robin, you want to ask a question?
Sure. So just continue on this theme that people matter. You've written in a certain way more than systems sometimes, often.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, can bridge builders actually be built? And what would it take, in your view, to do that?
I think that's one of the biggest questions I'm getting is on skills and so on, and how do we get to these millions more bridge builders? So I think it takes a few things. First of all, I do think that at the at higher education level, I just feel like we need to do so much more bringing, in most schools, the most popular club in business schools is the Social Entrepreneurs Club. And we just need to bring together, which USC has done for going back a couple decades. I remember when this started here, bringing together, so you brought together people interested in real estate and business and philanthropy and nonprofit. We just need to do that in a much bigger way, is bringing them all together. Because right now, in most places, they're really, really siloed. And I think that's problematic. Secondly, I think that having systems in government where it's easier to kind of move in and out, where you have governments might have alumni programs. So you start off there in government, you get a couple years. Victoria in Australia has this, and then you might go to work for Deloitte or someone else, but then you've gotten more business experience, and then they say, we want you to come back again. You can be at a higher level and managing things. The last thing I would say is just the systems and incentives within government. So we talk about catalyst by design agencies like NASA and DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Research Agency, which invented the internet, and they're set up to do bridge building. The personnel are evaluated that way. They have people who are just focused on things like, NASA has over 20 people just focused on market sensing around different technologies. Everyone's empowered to form different partnerships and relationships. And so it's a part of their DNA. And that makes a big difference. And if you want to be a DARPA program manager, by the way, it's the best job in all the federal government, because you get like a couple $2 billion and you get to fail at some things too, and you're forming all these relationships. But they're set up that way, and we just need that a little bit more. When we surveyed senior executives for the federal government on cross-sector collaboration, the biggest obstacle, they said, was there's no incentives to do this. So many of them are doing it just because they know it needs to be done, but they're not getting rewarded performance-wise for it, and so on. A friend of Jim Thompson, who's one of the leading guys in the federal government, he's worked on public-private partnerships, State Department, intelligence community, elsewhere. He thinks we need a job series even, where you can be an expert in project manager, but why don't we have people who have deep expertise in this sort of collaboration, and you can move up the ranks, and that's what your expertise is. It's one idea.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you one more. So you're a USC graduate, and you have bridge builder instincts and DNA. You've done it your life. You're a middle child, and you know how to bring people together. Okay, and then you walk into one of these non-DARPA cultures, ossified, old. What's the trampoline? Is there one? What can you do?
What's the trampoline? I think it depends on what level you're at and so on. But that is one of the when I talk to students all the time, and they don't want to be buried deep in the bowels of a bureaucracy somewhere. They want to do this kind of work. And I think it's looking for those sort of opportunities and opportunities to be a tri-sector athlete like you are, and I consider myself and others. I spoke to a couple months ago to 200 female social entrepreneurs in DC with an organization we work with, and asked, how many of you have worked in the private sector, how many in government, how many in nonprofit? Most of them raised their hands they were all tri-sector athletes. So we had a lot, and they just didn't know they were bridge building. So I think there's more and more people who are getting those sort of experiences, and the more we do that, the more they can change the culture. The last thing I'll say on that, Robin, is a friend of mine who used to be the head of human capital for the intelligence community out of what was called ODNI. His name is Ron Sanders, and he would say to me that this was after 9/11. They were hiring tons of young people into intelligence, and he said, we're in a race right now to see if those young people can change the culture before the culture squishes them and then they want to leave. And so I think we are starting to see around some of the new technologies and Gen AI in government, we're starting to see a little bit more of that, what I think is a healthy clash.
Terrific. So you also make a big point out of data and the importance of having data and shared information. And I totally get that. So I want to ask a question that's really specific to the USC Price School and the Bedrosian Center. And what is our role, and when should we be part of the data creation and data, and when is it important to have the university, the Price School, Bedrosian Center involved in data?
Well, there's a lot of different ways now. One is, and maybe your organization that you lead, I think we need a lot more cross-sector data platforms where organizations are creating the platforms like Houston created for individuals because right now a lot of the data sharing, we did a whole playbook for chief data officers 2.0, and a lot of it's happening within government. It's coming more slowly. There's a lot of reasons, but given the fact that almost everything government does now is across sectors, we need them to be cross-sector. And we don't have enough organizations kind of creating and taking the lead on that. And government's not always the best organization to do that. So I think that's one piece. A second one is government has a ton of data, really great and interesting data, but they don't have enough data scientists and people to analyze it. And so a lot of governments are working with universities like USC in partnerships where they'll be doing a lot of the data analysis. So in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, a lot of their projects, they also are doing some things on homelessness around the data system. They work with Carnegie Mellon to do a lot of that data analysis and partnerships. And the other piece there is providing a pipeline of students with expertise in data or human-centered design thinking, other sort of areas into governments now. Because as you mentioned, how many openings did you say in LA City? 10,000? 8,000. 8,000 openings. And governments, I think there's 900,000 state and local jobs right now which are unfilled, which we haven't seen ever in my 3.5 decades doing this right now. And a bunch of reasons for that, but one is just what we were talking about. People want to be able to do interesting things and they don't want to be stuck. So I think those are 3 different areas.
I also read with interest in your book that the importance of cultivating networks of trust. And I would imagine that places like the USC Price School could serve a convening function in that regard too, and do, which is important. I also read with interest this notion of cultivating cross-boundary leaders, and I'd like for you to, you're here at USC. How do we create the next generation of cross-boundary leaders? Are there different courses that people take? Are there different experiences that they have when they're in school? How do you do this?
Yeah, back when I wrote a book called Governing by Network 20 years ago, Steve Goldsmith, the former mayor of Indianapolis, and that got a lot of attention in grad schools. It was used in courses, and we got a grant from Smith Richardson and it was like a couple professors from the Kennedy School. Don was part of it, Steve and
When
others.
was this?
20 years ago.
20 years ago.
And it was, the grant was for professors, $25,000 I think they got for different professors who could put together the best network governance curriculums. And so I think that's a really key area, is the kind of curriculums and giving students those opportunities to do that. So my bugaboo is when I wrote a book called If We Can Put a Man on the Moon, Getting Big Things Done in Government. We had over.
So it just reminds me of one quick comment. It reminds me of a great teacher who was here at USC who taught a course in family practice, and she put 3 words on the board: context is everything. And if there's no way for folks in government or in the ecosystem to understand the context, it's very hard to imagine any kind of mutual anything. And that is, I think, I don't know if it's a lost art, but it's often a skip step, right? There's another young woman I know who is actually a USC Price graduate, and she's created a program for young women to become involved in politics and government and campaigns. Erica Lightman is her name. She's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember she called me up and said, please feel free to criticize what we're doing. We think we invented water. So it would be helpful. It would be helpful. Anyway, my question to you is really about, not to pick a fight, but to really to ask a question. One of the ideas that you posit in this book is that government can be the catalyzer. And people in philanthropy, many of whom are here, they, in their good moments, we in our good moments think, no, that's what we do. We're catalyzers, right? We have independence,
right.
We have your back, we can act quickly, we can take risks. So I'm curious to know what you think, whether you agree with that or not is your choice, but what do you think is the highest and best role for philanthropy in this blended government thing you've created?
Sure, and so I wrote another book a decade ago that I spoke here called Solution Revolution, how business, government, and social entrepreneurs are teaming up to solve society's biggest problems, which looked a lot at philanthropy there in that role. We are blessed in the US with a philanthropic system which is 10x, 100x times any other country. And at the scale of which, when I go to Canada, I was there last week, they would, kill for it. Other countries don't have these giant philanthropic sectors like we do. And so it offers us, so government's not alone like it is. The government's got philanthropy and nonprofits and now business playing a big role. But where I found that philanthropy has played such an important role is as ecosystem conveners and integrators often. So we've got a lot of cases in this book and my previous book of where the nonprofits or the philanthropic organizations actually played the key role in bringing together all the players, which is around, whether it's around malaria reduction and the role of the Gates Foundation. We've seen a 60% reduction in deaths from malaria over the last 20 years. Gates played a huge role in some other ones. Or anti-human slavery, where you've got a number of nonprofits and philanthropic organizations playing a role, because oftentimes they're the most trusted. they're more trusted than government and business and so on. The case we talk about in the book is the Nature Conservancy, which has done amazing work all over the world in preserving the environment and coral reefs and other areas. And they would tell me that oftentimes, even within a country where the finance ministry and the Department of Environment didn't even like talking to each other, so they would be the ones that would having to pull them together. So I think that's an incredibly important role, but also as funding things that are a little bit maybe too risky sometimes for government to do, and that being able to actually try out new projects. When Bloomberg was mayor, for a lot of things he did in education, he said, well, maybe we're not going to spend taxpayer dollars on this, but I want to just really try out some new things, see what works. So we got the philanthropic sector to actually put that money in.
Thank you. So Jim, my handler here, has given me the signal that it's time for your questions, and I want to make sure that, and thank you, Robin, for your questions, and Bill for your participation. Question right here.
This was very hopeful and encouraging, but my first thought always is context right now. And when you refer often to trust, my question to you is, how do you navigate the partisanship that you see? Because there's an unwillingness. I mean, I see it in local government, an unwillingness to even talk because we're on different sides of a political field, and so nothing gets done.
Thank you for asking that question. And could you tell us who you are? Would that be all right?
My name's Cara Esposito. Professor Ferris is my mentor, and I work at a nonprofit in
Thank
Los
you.
Angeles.
Thanks.
You know, I've been working 3.5 decades on trying to get people to focus on what works as opposed to what their ideology is. And I really thought that the data revolution was going to mean, I remember like giving presentations saying that now we're going to actually just focus on evidence and what's the evidence for the policy, and we can debate around that. And obviously, we've moved in the opposite direction, which is really concerning. So I think it's, you know, one of the things is, I don't know, we're not going to get people out of a lot of their, you know, maybe hopefully the next generations. People, everyone's in these very, very partisan, polarized zone right now. But I do think there's things that, like say at the local level or a mayor or governor can do. So if you look at, a friend of mine is at a think tank, and he's doing a whole analysis of governors and the ones that focused more on practical, pragmatic sort of things and looking at their popularity over time and so on, and showing a real correlation. So if you looked at some of the most popular governors in the country over the last 5 years, they've actually been the least kind of political ones, oftentimes bucking their own party. And was people want things at the local level. I mean, that when Mayor Reardon was mayor, there's a whole movement around these mayors that were both parties just really trying to like get the potholes fixed and doing a lot of those things. That builds up that trust. And so I think that's really important. When John Hickenlooper was mayor, now senator, and then governor, every one of his major initiatives, he involved partnerships, but he also always tried to reach across the aisle in the different, and what he said was that people start off with self-interest, and you have to understand that, and that all this, but the more you really talk about what the goals are, and the more you listen and get to that, you can actually get people towards a more common goal. So if you look at an issue like homelessness, no one wants to see people homeless. And so you're finding those areas of mutual advantage where you can bring people together and align them on practical solutions. Yes, it's harder than it was when I first started doing this. There's a lot less of that partisanship, but good government stuff and some of the societal problem is a little bit less. Still, it's less polarized than some of the other areas right now. So I think there are opportunities. And that's, again, a great, and also an important thing for philanthropies to be able to do is bringing those disparate groups together. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff happening right now over collective impact, and we've got a lot of strategies for co-creation and bringing those groups together. But I'm not going to be Pollyannish and say everything's going to be perfect, because we've been in a little dark place in that regard for a little while now.
I just want to add I agree with everything Bill said. I went and spoke to because they invited me, the Legislative Problem Solvers Caucus. These are legislators in Republicans and Democrats. One of the legislators from this area is the co-organizer, and they get together once a month. They wanted to talk to me about, what are the areas in which the public, Republicans and Democrats, can agree on. And so I went through all the polling that I've done and shared that with them. The other group, and I'm looking to see, is the No Labels group in Congress also. So there are these things that going on, and I've spoken to them when I've gone to Washington, that give me hope that, they're trying to break out of this, So anyway,
well, maybe on this one, Robin, from your experience, what did the mayors that you worked with, what do you think some of the things that they did?
They focused on that outcome, and still it was hell.
Yeah, it's hell. It's not easy. Other questions?
Let me just tell you a really quick funny thing. So when Mike Haley was deputy mayor of Los Angeles and Robin was working there too, he told me this funny story. I put it in my first book. He said, working in government sometimes it's like, and trying to get these things done, it's like you're on a big school bus and everyone has a break, but there's no one actually driving the bus.
And they all think they're the driver.
Yeah.
My name's Janae. I was an MPP and Price last year. I now work at Deloitte in government consulting. And so I had a question about, we're talking a lot about cross-sector data platforms. We're talking a lot about how across sectors we can use data to be more efficient, to provide better service. And I just have a question, and I'm curious about what you think about the ethical concerns around the incentives. Now, we say data is a language, but data is also currency. And what are some of the challenges around data commodification over the past 10 years that you've seen in your work or in your research? For example, in Houston, they created, like you displayed, the search platform, and the data that's being collected throughout the city, the municipality. Were there any challenges where non-public agencies or nonprofits or the private enterprises possibly might have felt incentivized to use the data that was being collected?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously, in this case, there wasn't a value in that data to try to sell. But there's, you have to put in place a lot of protections around PII information, of course, and we have a lot of privacy protections around data. But at some point, a lot of those things may have gone too far. In other words, so a friend of mine worked for the state of Indiana. He was a budget director there a number of years ago. And they were trying to figure out in Indiana why they had one of the highest infant mortality rates. And it didn't make sense in terms of the when you look at the GDP there or all that. And so they had a hypothesis around that. Oh, could it be drug use? Could it be other sort of things? But they wanted to find out by actually looking at the data. Well, it turned out that 17 different agencies they had to get data from to really understand that issue. Because of all the memorandum of understandings they had to do and everything, it took them a year and a half a year and a half to get the data. And this was simply data just to do an analysis, right? And it turned out that their hypothesis was wrong. The biggest problem was simply people didn't have expectant moms didn't have transportation to get, and they said, so it was like, it was actually a much easier fix in some respects. But it took a year and a half, and at that point, agencies oftentimes give up. And so we need a lot better ways of sharing that data. As part of our survey, we did a digital citizen survey globally, and one of the things we asked them, and it turns out that people are pretty willing, I think 70% of those we surveyed said that they're willing to have their information shared between government agencies and so on if they can get enough benefits from it. And but right now they just didn't feel like they were getting the benefits. And so these life events models and once only, these can be opt-in, of course. But if you look at a lot of the governments that have moved the furthest, they're in Asia, sometimes the Middle East, and other areas where maybe there's not as much protections, but I think we really need to look at that issue. The best example in the world, I was mentioning earlier, of kind of creating a great digital government data sharing platform, guess what country it's in? Anyone want to guess? Never would have believed it, probably. India. India, so 1.6 billion people, and every individual in India now has a digital ID. It was a big initiative called Aadhaar, and they started about a decade ago, way ahead of the US. Do any of you have digital IDs where you can do all sorts of government services? No. But they were able to do this, and now they have a lot of individuals, so hundreds of millions of people who are unbanked now have an opportunity essentially to use that. So they use it for banking, for many other services, and during COVID, that was a big part of it. So, they created the digital infrastructure and the data infrastructure, which is a really key element of this. And it's really important for inclusion issues, and we've written a lot about data and digital inclusion and how you go about looking at that. But I just think we need to take a look at a lot of the sort of rules and regulations around that and ask, are they all still needed? Because take the health area, that's where so many of the absolutely blockbuster sort of advances and innovations are occurring because all these researchers are sharing their data now on these platforms, and they're able to dramatically accelerate progress.
So since you mentioned health data, I wanted to follow up on that previous question because there was a recent paper in Science where researchers, one Optum, which essentially is large as any European country in terms of its number of enrollees, looked at its data, and what it wanted to see, it had a very benign and socially beneficial objective, which is to say who should get more chronic disease management. So let's go into the Optum data, they're a large insurer, and say who do we see is seeking additional care, let's say if they have diabetes or something like that. And they built a predictive algorithm to say who is at risk. And those people for whom they predicted would be at risk would then get extra services to try to prevent adverse outcomes. Well, it turns out race was a big predictor of not getting access to care. No surprise to any of us who work in this field. But they built this algorithm, and so what it turned out is that white people were getting extra services. And this was published in Science. And so you start with a very objective, and this is why I think your building networks and working with community is so important. Another example is in Medicare, they went the opposite way. We have an epidemic with opioids, and in the interest of privacy, Medicare decided that they would not reveal who is in the Medicare population is taking opioids. So for example, we had researchers who wanted to look at who's prescribing opioids, how long are people taking them, why are they getting addicted. All that research was shut down by the government in the interests of privacy because you worry about revealing who is doing these behaviors. But on the other hand, so all of this is by way of saying that especially in the health space where you can see obvious advantages to the data revolution, there are formidable challenges.
We have time for one more question. Yes? Or two more. Okay, two more. 1, 2. All right.
So going off of Dennis' point about the healthcare, by the way, my name is Oliver. I work in the insurance brokerage area, especially in employee benefits. So with our medical insurance carrier partners, we've seen a lot of pressure on them to reduce their premiums for employers on like group medical plans. And then that's kind of related to the prescription drug pricing as well. And we have also seen that the regulators start trying to target pharmaceutical benefit managers and pharmaceutical companies separately in 2 different proposed bills. So my question is, how would you navigate this kind of situation when there is competing financial interests in the private sector? How would you navigate that kind of situation as a bridge builder? Not necessarily in the private sector, but let's say coming from the government space, how would you navigate that kind of situation as a bridge builder to solve the problem of rising prescription drug pricing? If that makes sense.
I'm not an expert on prescription drug pricing, so I can't necessarily answer that, but I apologize for that. But maybe on the healthcare and insurance space, how many of you have read any work by Danny Kahneman? Here, just a few. So I'm a huge fan of his work. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And so 2 things with regard to that. So first of all, Kahneman has a book out with Cass Sunstein, another brilliant writer. It's called Noise. And what they look at is with all of these systems, like especially within the insurance area, a lot of case studies in government, you have all this noise in the system where you could have one actuary who's basically saying, estimating it would, this is the amount, and another one wildly different with the same sort of data. And it's all based on because as humans, we all have bias in our system. And he said, that's all these noise in the system that we need to find ways of taking it out of the system. And unlike a lot of other researchers, he's actually pretty, in that book, they are pretty bullish on AI in that regard. And so I'm going to turn this around. So we hear a lot about AI bias, right, and the data and the bias. And we've done a lot of work on trustworthy AI and how do you take the bias out of the data. And there's a lot of techniques now, and there's probably, $50 to $100 million in research going into this at universities right now. But whenever you have humans making decisions, you have bias in the system because we all have confirmation bias or a lot of other kinds of bias that Kahneman and Tversky wrote about in their Nobel Prize winning work. And so can we actually use AI now to try to de-bias inherently biased systems? And sometimes what they talk about is some of these systems where we think that there's bias, it's actually not bias, it's noise. It's noise in the system just because of humans having this. And so I think there's a lot, we put out a study on that, there's a lot of opportunity there to look at, yes, we need to do a lot of looking at the actual data involved and making sure that that's not bias going in, but can we take inherently biased systems and parole and science sentencing or a whole variety of other areas and de-bias them? One of the stories that Kahneman and Tversky have in their book is about sentencing. And it's pretty remarkable, it's a behavioral science sort of data where they found that judges post-lunch, when they're kind of sugar, they ended up being much harsher on the sentences than pre-lunch. Just the time of day that you happen to be in there was one of the best indicators of what the sentences were going to be. And that's just, we're humans, so can you do various things of trying to take some of that bias out of inherently biased systems, I think is going to be a really interesting area looking forward.
So I'm Christine Beckman. I'm the director of the Center for Social Innovation here. So
Oh,
centers
wonderful.
supporting other centers. So I just want to ask a question sort of on the innovation front. I mean, because I'm with you, cross-sector, implementation, all of this stuff is, all of these data things are super important. But Robin, you sort of asked us when you sort of said, you know, philanthropy thinks they have the answer. Government thinks they have the answer. And so if we think about innovation, we think about where does innovation come from? I mean, you use the word co-production, co-creation, right? And so I guess I'm curious just from where have you, when you in your careers, when you've done your research, where are the ideas that you've seen that have really come from outside, from people on the ground, from the community, from unexpected places? I'm sort of curious, you know, the idea that then gets run with and you build bridges with, but sometimes the ideas, you know, from an innovation perspective are coming from unexpected places. So I was just curious if you had any examples of things you'd seen that were in that vein, really true co-production.
Yeah, and so I think that's why governments need to have what I written about as open functionality. So when during the Obama administration, a guy who was the CTO was Todd Park, who's kind of was a Silicon Valley tech guy, and he was one of the ones that had to come in after healthcare.gov. The original launch was such a disaster in the website. And he would always say that there's always more innovation outside the walls of your organization than inside of it. So the more you can be open and find ways of bringing in all those ideas, the more innovation you're going to have. It's kind of the outside in. And so again, going back to NASA, they do prizes and challenges where they've done over 100. They found like for one of the prizes, it was actually a physicist in Russia that won the challenge. Who would have known that this person would have had that sort of idea? Or small business grants through SBIR, through all of these different things where you're trying to bring in and even spin in commercial innovation, but you need to be able to have those channels and avenues to be able to access that and to be able to see where that is. So when you look at social entrepreneurs, so I've sponsored a project for the last decade with the Halcyon House Incubator in DC. We've trained now over 150 different social entrepreneurs and just some amazing ideas, but they're very early stage and then they need to figure out how to scale. So for them, a lot of innovative ideas, but they don't know how to work through the systems of government or even businesses. And so those individuals, then it's important to understand what those systems are and what their places are in the various systems. But the innovations happen everywhere and even inside government. But the more governments can have open functionality for saying, tell us what your ideas are and your best ideas, the better. In Edmonton, they actually, for law enforcement, they had a whole incubator where they were bringing in, looking at tech solutions and others from business, from nonprofits and others, which is very unusual for law enforcement area. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Jim, but first I want to thank you for writing this book and for coming here today and talking about it, which again has been very informative and inspiring for all of us. Robin, as always, a pleasure, to be here with you and to your insights as well as your great questions after reading this book, so important. Dana, thank you so much to you and your staff for convening this today and for making this possible. And Jim, thank you for asking me to asking the Bedrosian Center to co-sponsor this. So let's give Bill and Robin a big hand. Thank you. Thanks.
It's not new. Public-private partnerships or bridge builders are not new. But they're more frequent than they used to be. And while the growth hasn't been as fast as we hoped, I think your book, your framework, can get dreamers to think about how to actually do finding solutions to problems. So for that, thank you. And Robin and Mark, thank you too.